for this one? Okay, I'm getting a thumbs up.
Emily, I was waiting for you to say that, and the recording is happening now.
Okay, great. Recording happening now, so just a heads up on that. So here is our agenda for today. Obviously, we're doing the welcome and introductions right now, followed by a keynote from Laura McCarthy, and a number of excellent presentations until 11:30 this morning. We'll have a little break until 1 o'clock. We'll come back and have a drone demonstration with Simon Wiebel of Drone Amplified Incorporated, followed by a very short business meeting. Everybody who registered for the session today is welcome to stay for that business meeting, but certainly not expected either. So that is open to everyone. Okay, so my name is Emily Homan. I'm the chair of the Prescribed Fire Council. And again, welcome. And I'd like to pass it off to Barb with Southwest Fire Science Consortium to do a little introduction as well. And I'm going to go ahead and stop sharing.
Thanks, Emily. Just trying to share my screen here. There we go. So for those of you who haven't heard of the Southwest Fire Science Consortium, usually I ask people to raise their hands, but we're virtual, so I won't do that. Our purpose basically is bringing together science and management, and we are funded by the Joint Fire Science Program, which is an interagency organization. They are congressionally funded each year. They've been around for more than 20 years now, and they fund the majority of the wildland fire research in the entire country, basically. An independent review back in around 2008, I believe, resulted in the Fire Science Exchange Network, of which we are a part. And so here's the map. There are 15 of us. We basically cover Arizona, New Mexico, a little bit of Texas, and a little bit of southern Utah. The idea is to have a national network to accelerate the awareness, understanding, and adoption of wildland fire science within these regions. And we try to be inclusive, impartial, end user driven, which means we really want to know what people on the ground think and what they need. We try to be collaborative, innovative, and facilitative. And as far as who is our audience, we did sort of start out as more of this scientists and managers only kind of audience. We've really expanded that, and we don't just talk to agency folks. We want to talk to ranchers and landowners, private landowners. We would like everyone to be a part and tell us what your science needs are, or what kinds of things you're struggling with on your own property. And we also talk to the general public, and educators. We're working on an educational program on wildfire. Like I said, we are one of 15, and this is just a screenshot of our website, just to give you an idea what it looks like. We do webinars and stuff, so that's what's right up front. And the goal is to build communication among these groups, among the scientists, the educators, and the practitioners, and that kind of thing. Our website is searchable, so feel free to go to it and just search whatever kind of topic you're looking for, whatever you want information on. We do produce a lot of things as well. We have obviously a website, a quarterly newsletter. We, during non-COVID times, do 1 to 2 smaller workshops or field trips per year. We really hope to get back to that in about a year. We also do a monthly webinar series, which has been a little bit more frequent than that lately. We have working papers, which are short syntheses on specific topics. And typically in the past, we've chosen these topics based on what managers tell us, but the agencies happen to be the loudest voices and the biggest voices. So if we get ideas from other folks, we would certainly consider those. We also participate and organize in a regional fire conference about every 4 years. We are working on some new virtual products. We'll have some new story maps, working on virtual field trips through the story map idea, which is GIS interface, sort of a map. It's a story made out of maps kind of But it's a nice way to have a virtual field trip is what we've found. We're also working on some interpretive signs in some areas where there have been wildfires. And we do have a proposal system. If you would like to tell your story, we can help you tell your story either through a video or through a story map or a field trip, whatever works. And these are just some of the things that we've done through our proposal system, things that were suggested to us from other people. And this is just a glimpse of some of our partners, and I added the Prescribed Fire Council on there because it wasn't on there before, so it is now. And we are always looking for new partners. So if anyone has any questions, wants to know some of the things that we do, wants to know how you can learn from us or how we can learn from you, if you want to give us information, I'm happy to chat. Feel free to give me a call or shoot me an email. And there's my email and my phone number. And I do put my money where my mouth is. This is actually a prescribed burn at my house. That is my house. So I have been there, and I will pass it back to Emily. And like I said, feel free to either call or email me with questions. Thank you.
Great, thank you so much, Barb, and thank you again for co-hosting with us today. Absolutely wonderful to take advantage, find some silver linings in the need to do a virtual meeting this year by expanding our reach, and thank you for your assistance in doing that. It's been great. All right, so we have had a request, and I think it's a great one. If everyone could use the chat window to introduce themselves, your name, who you work for, if you work for someone, or if you're a private landowner, etc. Maybe a few words on what your interest is in joining us today. That'd be fantastic, just so that we can get to know each other a little bit in this virtual space. All right, so we're going to move right into our first talk, our keynote address from Laura McCarthy, the State Forester of New Mexico. Laura is going to be speaking about the future of prescribed burning on private lands in New Mexico. So, Laura, please take it away. And thank you so much for joining us.
Yeah, can I be heard?
I can hear you loud and clear.
Okay, good. And I do want to use some slides. I've had bandwidth issues lately, so hopefully this will work. Let's see, to have a share screen option.
Okay, I think Eitan should be able to help you with that if you don't see.
And if not, I won't use them. I can just, what would you like me to do? Use or not use?
Laura, I just made you a co-host, so you should be able to share your slides. Let me know if that's not working.
Okay. Are you seeing something now?
Yes, we are. Yep.
Okay, great. So I want to start by saying that, well, we have a Prescribed Fire Act for New Mexico that is at Legislative Council Services. We confirmed yesterday that Representative McQueen will be the lead sponsor on the bill. And it is considered an agency bill. What's remarkable to me is I was just remembering what I think was the very first meeting of this Prescribed Fire Council. I know at the time I was working for the Nature Conservancy as I was not working for the New Mexico chapter. I was working for our DC office in government relations. And no, actually, it was part of the Global Fire Initiative, so the point being, this was a long time ago. It might have even been 10 years ago. And the idea that we could have a Prescribed Fire Act in New Mexico be, that we could introduce something into the legislature and have it be taken seriously and, you know, have a legislator who's chair of a key committee say, I'm going to take this bill on because it's well thought out, is remarkable. And it's because of all of you. And those of you who were in the room, you know, I think we were at the Fire Academy. You know, you remember how far off that seemed. So I just want to really shout out compliments to the Prescribed Fire Council and the years and years of work you've put in. So now we have this opportunity. It's not going to be a slam dunk because despite all the work that we've put in, and that's because of there are forces larger than us called the Trial Lawyers Association that we need to bring along. And we couldn't really, they didn't want to engage in conversation with us in our working group process because, well, they wanted to respond to a bill. So I'm actually I want to jump ahead. So I have some slides that I'm just going to flip through really quickly. We do have a new forest action plan in our state, and I do want you to just have a quick little picture of what's in it. If I can just get the mouse over to the right place. Sorry for the technical problems here. Yeah, if I don't, it's not gonna crud. It's just not wanting to advance. In fact, can anybody even hear me? It seems totally locked.
Yeah, I can hear you loud and clear, Laura.
Okay, all right, you're just gonna look at this then, and I'm, because I can't even get it to move, and I'm just gonna do an overview without any slides other than this one. Okay, so we do have this new forest action plan. It has it has 10 act strategies in it that are interlinked, and a key one from the perspective of prescribed fire is our fire management strategy, which ties to our strategy of restoring forests and watersheds and our emphasis on private land stewardship, in addition to an all lands approach. And we also have a workforce component under a strategy that's about the restoration economy. And from a prescribed fire perspective, I think that's particularly important. This forest action plan also addresses rare plants, and some of them are affected negatively by catastrophic fire, which again brings in the need for prescribed fire and fire adapted systems. And we have a reforestation strategy, which is about what we do with the burned lands, and an outdoor recreation strategy, which I mentioned because I think it was really interesting what happened this year with the Medio fire and the clear role of the prescribed burn that had taken place the prior year and how that influenced the, well, how that kept that fire from rolling right into some of the most heavily used outdoor recreation areas in the state. And so putting fire into places that can create buffers around important recreation areas. We're not really there yet in terms of our planning, but I think that is a place that we need to go. So our forest action plan is on the State Forestry website. You can find it by just Googling New Mexico Forest Action Plan, and it'll take you to a page that has a link that you can click on to download the plan. It's not in its final stage because we're waiting for review from USDA, but as far as we're concerned, we're done. All right, so House Memorial 42 was really spearheaded by the Nature Conservancy in 2019, and Representative McQueen introduced the memorial. It called for a working group of diverse parties to do a study of the barriers to expanding the use of prescribed fire. And the council showed up in a big way. The co-chairs were, or co-vice chairs were Doug Boykin and Ann Bradley. And there was heavy participation from the organizations whose logos you see here. Star Club.
Laura, I think we may have lost your audio there just for a moment. Can you hear me? Eitan, are you able to hear Laura? Just checking that's not my internet connection.
No, I think we lost her audio, and so we may need to, Laura, you may need to log off and log on again. So I think everyone just stand by. I think we'll give Laura a chance to log on again and see if she can pick up where she left off. So Emily, this is Eitan here. While we wait for this, we can either move ahead in our agenda or talk a little bit more about HM42, and I'll kind of leave it to you to decide on where you think would be best used to use this time. I do want to let you know that I do have the HM42 working group report pulled up on my screen, if that would be useful. So just let you think about that for a sec.
I think that would be great, Eitan, if you wouldn't mind bringing that up. And if you want to go through any of it, is that what you're thinking?
Yeah, I'm thinking giving a review of what the report recommended, and hopefully by then we can get Laura back.
Okay, yeah, go ahead, and I'll reach out to her here and see if her internet connection has gone down completely or something like that that's irretrievable. So please take it away, and we'll continue working on getting Laura back.
Okay,
And
before you mute, do you see my do you see this very text-heavy PDF?
Yes, sure do.
Okay,
Readability is difficult, so if you could zoom in a little bit if you want to show the text, that'd be great.
for sure. I'm going to jump ahead in the document to this area. And I'm also going to try to admit some people that are in the waiting room. So basically, when we were starting the HM42 working group, we were thinking that our current situation was like these broken triangles here. The top triangle, we had high, and we currently do have highly variable permitting for ignitions in New Mexico. We also know in the green triangle that we don't have enough prescribed fire on private lands. And training for private practitioners is very difficult. There isn't a state training system. There's kind of NWCG, and then there's kind of neighboring states that may have systems, but not something in New Mexico. And then the darkest triangle is our uncertain liability category, and the difficulty in prescribed fire insurance for private practitioners. And a lot of this, you know, everyone on this call, I'm sure, is very familiar with the kind of big stack of barriers to prescribed fire that are kind of cataloged every few years. And so the working group had this mental model that our desired situation would be in a defined liability category, have accessible training for private practitioners, have accessible and appropriate ignitions permitting, and the result of that, we all hope, would be increased prescribed fire on private lands in New Mexico. And so I'm gonna jump a little bit, trying to just bear with me. I'm trying to find the area in the document that has the recommendations by category. And I will stop sharing so no one gets motion sickness from me scrolling around in the document. So just again, this is 2020. I appreciate everyone's patience.
Yeah, and thank you for doing this, Eitan. I did just want, as you're scrolling, just wanted to point to the chat box. I did put the link for that report in the chat, and I think we have Laura back as well. Can you hear us, Laura? She might just take a second to connect. I just let her in from the waiting room.
Okay, excellent. Thanks, Emily.
Good, I'm back. I'm just on my personal phone, not using Wi-Fi. Eitan, you kept going though, right? You just picked up right where I left off?
It wasn't as seamless as that. I got to the triangle model of where we're at and where we hope to be with HM42. So please pick up where you left off.
Well, let me talk then about the three pieces of the legislation. I'm going to deviate, no slides. I'm going to deviate from where we are with the with where we were with the report to where we actually are with the legislation, and then I have a little bit of a call to action to you all. So the legislation would do three things. The first is it would clarify that the liability status of prescribed fire, which currently is undefined. And that means that because of this one particular statute around damages, that it could very easily get interpreted as strict liability, which is the worst possible situation for prescribed burners. And so what we want to do in this legislation is define a negligence standard for prescribed fire that would apply to anybody who was burning, whether they had training or not, as long as it wasn't agricultural burning or acequia burning. They are accepted from this because we did not want to make any changes to the traditional ag burning in our state. The second thing is that it would set up a voluntary training and certification program. And we had a lot of discussion about the NWCG standards and concluded that while very appropriate, obviously, for federal, state, local governments and tribes, that for a private landowner, it's really a pretty big lift. Could be a 10-year process to get to the point of being able to hold sufficient NWCG quals to do prescribed burning on his or her land. So we decided to do something that a lot of other states have done, and that is create a state-specific training program. Now, as you all know, money is not really available for new programs. And so by kind of the New Mexico tradition of digging deep into our partnerships, we've been able to devise a partnership between NMSU Extension, Doug Cram, who I believe is speaking later, and the Forestry Division, where the curriculum development would be collaboratively developed by under the leadership of NMSU, and the trainings would be hosted and offered through NMSU, and the kind of accounting for who's certified and whether they did or didn't get recertified, the accounting, the record keeping would fall to our Forestry Division, which is kind of a natural fit because we're already tracking local government qualifications for NWCG quals. So that's the training and certification piece. Actually, there are 4 parts. Okay, I lied. The third part is around permitting. And Eitan, I hope, explained kind of why or what the issue was with permitting, with inconsistency across counties and just kind of a free-for-all. We don't want to mess with counties' right to regulate open burning. And we also don't want to mess with the smoke permitting through the New Mexico Environment Department, which currently really works very well. What we do want to do, and what this legislation would authorize, is to establish guidelines for counties that choose to require ignition permits for prescribed burning, which would be either broadcast or pile burning. And the guidelines would be required, as in, if you're going to you don't have to regulate ignition permitting, but if a county chooses to, then they would be required to follow the guidelines. Then the fourth element is around damages. And we had a lot of discussion around how to provide an incentive for people to become certified prescribed burners. And one incentive, obviously, is the greater availability of insurance. And so that doesn't have to happen in statute. It's a little bit of a hypothesis, like if we do X, Y, and Z, then insurance rates will come down. But it is also backed up by what's happened in other states. But we wanted to provide a further assurance or incentive. And now here's where it gets a little complicated. There's an 1882 law about criminal damages that has in there this little piece saying that if you prescribe burn, that you are going and are found liable, that you have to pay double the damages. And so I don't think we have any attorneys on here, but apparently it's a thing. First of all, it's stuck in the wrong place, and it's an 1882 law. So with the leadership of the attorney at Energy, Minerals, and Natural Resources Department, Cheryl Beta, and with leadership from Representative McQueen, I think what will happen is that this damages piece will get tied to negligence and moved out of the criminal portion of the law into the civil. Now, let me just wrap up with kind of where we are. So this damages piece is likely the part that the trial lawyers hate the most. So we may be faced with a decision. We're not there yet, but this may come where we have to jettison the damages, the reduction of damages, in order to actually get the bill through the legislative process. And my opinion is I'd rather get a statute that allows us to start expanding the use of prescribed burning. And if it's not working the way we need it to, fix it down the line after we've socialized it, then cling to the damages part because we wanted to provide an incentive. Others of you may have a different opinion as well. I want to put our core team members who are attending today just on notice. I hate to do this, but I have to ask you to help with something over the weekend. We have some frequently asked questions that Nina Karanko at TNC and I have put together that we need your input on over the weekend in order to have them in our pocket for a meeting with the trial lawyers on Tuesday. So final call to action is, any help you can provide to legislators to help them understand why prescribed burning is necessary, why we need to expand the use. Please do. We may send out, or TNC may do things like action alerts down the road. And I apologize for my connectivity problems. And yeah, that was like the worst possible time to have it die. So with that, if we have time for questions, we can do that, or I'll leave that up to the moderator as to how you want to pace things from here.
Yeah, thanks so much, Laura. Really appreciate it. And no worries on the connectivity problems. I think we're all pretty used to living in this virtual space and the issues that can occur. So thanks so much for being able to rejoin us and finish out your presentation. Mary, I believe you have been keeping an eye on the chat box. Do we have time for questions? And do we have any questions from folks that Laura could answer?
Yeah, so the question got answered in the chat box, and that was the reference to the statute in 1882. So thanks for that. And for those of you who have the same question, be sure to check the chat for that. We probably have time for one more question. Is anybody want to unmute and ask it? Well,
while that's happening, I want to say that the full report is worth taking a look at. It is posted, among other places, on the Forest Guild website. It's very well written, easy to read, and has a ton of great information in it. And just want to shout out to Emily, Eitan, and Doug Cram, who just put hundreds of hours into that report.
Great. And pushing the chat, the link to that report is also in our chat this morning. Okay, Emily, I think we're ready to move on.
All right. Well, thank you, Mary. And thank you again, Laura. That was really appreciated. Great way to kick us off this morning. A super, super important topic to the future of prescribed fire in New Mexico. So, and thank you for your leadership and all your hard work from the memorial all the way through bringing the report to completion and working on this legislation as well. It's super appreciated by everybody in the prescribed fire community. All right. Well, thank you, Laura. And moving on to our next speaker, we're moving into a section of presentations that are lessons from 2020, of which I'm sure there are many. And so we're going to start from hearing from Eitan, talking about the All Lands Burn Team. So Eitan, are you ready to go?
Yeah, I am. So let me, I'm going to share a screen and see if this hopefully doesn't crash. Okay, so hey everyone, I'm going to talk about the All Hands All Lands burn team. I'm going to give an overview of the team and then talk about some challenges and lessons learned, which seem to be sometimes these lessons you relearn. I want to start out by thanking and acknowledging the folks who helped get this idea off the ground via a meeting in Espanola, I believe at the Espanola Ranger District back in late 2017. Emily Homan, Jordan Stone, who was with Rocky Mountain Youth Corps at the time, Dennis Carroll, Jeremy Bailey, and I hope I'm not forgetting anyone who wasn't at that formative meeting that helped shape this. And then I also want to give recognition to a couple of folks who since then have worked really hard to make this a success. I want to mention Colin Haffey at the Nature Conservancy of New Mexico, who's worked really hard, Dave Lasky, who works with me at the Forest Stewards Guild, and Sam Berry, also at the Forest Stewards Guild. So just there's a lot of people that helped make these this project and program a success. And I hope I didn't forget anyone, but I wanted to mention those at the start. So let me see if I can get my slide to advance. Increase in capacity, kind of connected to what Laura was talking about. Prescribed fire is hard. And as many of you know who are on the call here, and everyone has their own challenges. And so I feel like no one's exempt from the capacity challenging list here, including NGOs like the Forest Stewards Guild. We're really working hard, but we have our own limitations and challenges. And sometimes those challenges, they're different for different organizations. So that's just kind of a recognition that prescribed fire is hard, and we kind of all have our own unique situations and challenges that we're working with. And the idea behind this effort, which is situated, it touches down in the Rio Grande waterfront landscape. And so it has a geographic, I should have said this at the beginning, it has a geographic boundary right now. And that is that large landscape that extends from Albuquerque up into southern Colorado and encompasses the Jemez and southern Sangre de Cristo Mountains. So the this increasing capacity for prescribed fire is really at the core of the All Hands All Lands burn team. And we're trying to tackle capacity issues by focusing on coordination, planning, getting operational and actually practicing fire, investing in people's training, focusing on standards and consistent liability coverage. And one of the other ways we do that is developing agreements with partners, because, I mentioned this earlier that, barriers to prescribed fire, as Lania Quinn Davidson, who many of you know, often the barriers is a very well-studied area. And one of the common things is that agreements are a challenge. So we try to get agreements in place so that we can check that challenge off the list. So a lot of partners have helped with this project, which started in 2018. And this is, I think, many of them, probably not all of them. So I want to thank everyone for kind of working with the Forest Stewards Guild and the All Hands All Lands burn team to get things done. This picture is a Forest Stewards Youth Corps member, Jasmine, who is really, she's happy there. I don't know if you can tell, she's happy. She's igniting on state land on a burn bossed by the BLM out of Taos. So that gives you a picture of like kind of all hands, all lands happening. NGO staff who's a youth corps member implementing a prescriber and on state trust lands, with a burn boss from the BLM. So you can kind of imagine all the agreements and things that are in place to make that happen. So the team does do planning. Here's an example of a plan that we really hope to implement this year. Obviously, this year is going to be challenging with COVID and smoke, and we'll hear more about that later. But we are actively developing plans, and I want to give a lot of credit to Dave Lasky, Sam Berry, and Daniel Godwin for doing a lot of the really important planning work here. And this is a map. The yellow orange line is the Rio Grande Water Fund footprint, and you can see the red dots indicate where burns have happened. This is a little out of date. There's been some more burns than this map indicates, but it shows some of the coverage and also some of the areas where I think there's opportunities for to kind of develop and invest in more work in places that haven't seen a lot of this team touching down on projects. So there's been some really successful burns, like this 2018 Alamosa Rx, where the All Hands All Lands burn team contributed to an El Rito burn on the Carson National Forest, and I'm really proud of it. We brought about 20 people, so about a hand crew that included a holding boss and engine boss and some leadership. So that was a really successful effort. And it created some space for future managed fire. And I'm going to just kind of gloss over this so we can kind of create, so I don't get behind on the clock. Here is a graph showing on the vertical axis is the number of burns by each main jurisdiction, and you can see the private is the smallest, and it's definitely something that doesn't escape my eye. And there's definitely some opportunities to get more private burns underway with this All Hands All Lands burn team initiative. And I know this is really text heavy, and I apologize. And so you can always connect with me afterwards if anyone's interested in all the exact burns and year and season. But this is kind of showing everything from when we started to right now. And you can see our last burn is down here on the Pot Mountain RX with the Taos BLM. And it was, there were All Hands All Lands firefighters contributing to that burn. And it happened in March 2020, right before kind of COVID shutdown hit. And there hasn't been a burn since then that the All Hands All Lands burn team has contributed or led. And here's another table, hopefully easier on the eyes here. So 57 different people participating, worked on 9 jurisdictions with 19 different agencies, and about 427 operational shifts worked by the All Hands All Lands burn team that has contributed to 7,480 acres. And these photos are from a burn that Santa Clara Pueblo planned and implemented, and the burn added two qualified positions to help make that happen. And that was a few years ago now. So, you know, obviously COVID and smoke are a huge challenge, and we have a slot to talk about that later in the agenda, but I'm going to just say collaborative burning is hard. Mixing partners together with different backgrounds and experience and high-risk situations is something that the Forest Stewards Guild takes really seriously and takes a lot of kind of care in crafting that so that risk is mitigated. Getting the right resources in the right place at the right time is just tricky, as I'm sure many on this people know. You know, that's definitely a unique skill, and it just takes practice to work on that. And you know, the All Hands All Lands burn team is not in a resource ordering system. We're kind of outside the suppression world, and so we're a little different. So we've been communicating and working with all our partners to try to describe what we are and what we can provide. So future direction, more private land burning, especially more private broadcast burning, is definitely something that I personally want to see. And we are, want to integrate into federal and state efforts more seamlessly. And this 3+1 pile squad, some of the squad members are on the call right now, which I'm really happy about. And it is what we believe is a very COVID responsible way of gathering a small squad led by an RXB3 to burn piles this winter at a small but continuous scale. And I have to give Dave Lasky and others a lot of credit for coming up with that idea, and Sam Berry a lot of credit for doing a lot of the hard work to make it happen over the past few months. And we hope that this pile squad will be able to work away at the pile backlog here in the waterfront footprint. So with that, I hope I didn't go over. I didn't see any hand waving. I see Mary unmuting, so I'll put my information in the chat box if anyone wants to connect with me about this later.
Well, Eitan, you have a question. So from the chat, Barb is wondering if the burns that you had on the list could have occurred without the help of the All Hands All Lands group.
Yeah, that's a good question. I think some of them would definitely have occurred, but some of them wouldn't. So I think some of the private land burns wouldn't have happened. The Pueblo burns, I don't know if that would have happened without All Hands All Lands burn team providing an RXB2 burn boss. And maybe some of the federal burns would have been different or delayed without some of the contributions. So it's a mixed answer. It's not a solid yes or no.
But it's a really valued resource here in the Southwest, and it really is enabling more prescribed burning to go on than what could go on without it. It's a safe statement, right, Eitan?
Yeah, I'll agree to what you just said, Mary. Thank you.
Great. Okay, well, I hope that I have given you guys the encouragement to put your questions in the chat, because we don't have any more time. Oh, there's one more question that came in the chat. Will the All Hands All Lands burn team work in the Rio Grande, Middle Rio Grande Conservative Bosque south of Socorro?
Yeah, so again, that's not a super clear answer. I think as it's currently funded, no, because of we just have to be very conscious of the current funding and where the footprint of the Rio Grande Water Fund is. And I don't know exactly where it is on the southern terminus there. But I think the agreements and the people and the know-how is there to bring it to other places outside the footprint of the water fund. We just have to do a little creative thinking. So I appreciate that. And I see Barb's comment now, replicate elsewhere. Yeah, I think we can hear more about that later, but I think there are some ideas of bringing that concept and this idea into Colorado more and some other places as well.
All right, thank you, Eitan. And we're ready, Emily, to move on.
Great, thanks so much, Eitan. All right, our next speaker is Rich Sack. And Rich is the Fire Management Planning Specialist for the Carson and Santa Fe National Forests. And he's going to be talking about the utilization of pods in fire suppression / management decisions. And Rich, I certainly hope that you will help us define what pods are for those who are not aware of that spatial fire management planning model.
Oh,
and
yeah.
Thank you so much, Rich. Take it away.
No problems. So I work for both national forests, and if you can tell me what my job is exactly, I'll give you $100. But part of my job was we were approached by the regional office with the Forest Service about a new initiative that's been taking place nationwide, which is, in short, we call it pods. Let me pull up my presentation here. And pods is stands for potential operational delineations. But the way it started is that the Forest Service underwent a nationwide effort to perform quantitative risk assessments on the landscape, which looks at all sorts of different layers and values at risk, including natural resources as well as constructed resources across the forest landscapes. And then the Rocky Mountain Research Station came up with a plan to start leveraging all the information from these risk assessments to help kind of inform fire management strategy and decision making ahead of time. And so the process for creating pods was rather lengthy, but the idea was that we brought folks from both national forests together on the Carson and the Santa Fe, and then started looking at the data the risk assessments produced. So the potential operational delineations are pretty much areas where we can reasonably say from the analysis that you can stop a fire under most conditions. And those
Hey,
were—
Rich.
Yes.
Sorry, if I could stop you real quick. Could you hit the presentation button just to make your slides a little bit bigger so that we can see them a little bit better?
Okay. Let's see.
And that's down in the, let me see if I can, okay, right there.
Anywhere.
If you can hit that button, can you see my mouse down in the lower left hand or right hand corner? Sorry.
No.
Okay, so do you see the slider bar down in that zooms in and out?
Let's try it one more time. Slider bar that zooms in and out. Let's see if I can make this part full screen. Is that better?
Perfect.
Okay. So where were we? So we looked at potential control line locations, and with fire management folks and line officers, we started chopping up the landscape with operational delineation. So pretty much places where we know with some certainty that we could stop a fire, to create these polygons that that mostly encompass Forest Service land, but also, you know, if like a jurisdictional boundary is not necessarily a good place to stop a fire. And so we started looking at road systems and what have you from the analysis to turn the landscape into a big conglomeration of polygons. And then the second part of it was to classify each pod or polygon by these different strategic response categories. So if you look in the lower left, there's maintain, restore, protect, exclude, and high complexity. And this is for the Tono National Forest, so we didn't include exclude. But maintain is more or less saying, you know, the ecosystem is in a place where it can accept fire with mostly positive benefits to the landscape, and values at risk are relatively easily protected from fire. Whereas restore is, you know, the landscape could use fire to do restoration activity. You know, there's some deviation from the natural range of variability, as in things are overgrown and there's heavier fuel loadings. And, you know, we can look to manage fire to restore the landscape there. Protect more or less says, you know, there's lots of values at risk that would be negatively impacted by fire. And so those are areas where we'd probably consider, you know, suppressing a fire when it starts. Then lastly, high complexity is an area where there's natural resources that could definitely benefit from wildfire directly adjacent to high values at risk that would be damaged by a fire. And so it's kind of a mixed bag where you really got to think about what you're doing, especially when it comes to managing wildfire in those areas. And to get to this pretty color-coded map, we got together as the two forests with all of our resource specialists, line officers, and fire management folks, got them into a big room together. This was pre-COVID, of course, to really hash out how different values at risk, either natural or constructed, respond to fire. So if there's a benefit at low flame lengths, that would be positive. Whereas if like I don't think any house would ever benefit from fire. So net benefit to constructed features are generally negative. And we ranked all of those and then sent the Rocky Mountain Research folks home to run their models, and they came up with initial classifications. And then the line officers across the Santa Fe and Carson National Forest made final determinations about the color coding and strategic response for each pod. And so once we got there, we developed our own pretty color coded maps and put them into use. And pretty much what the color coding tells us is, it's kind of a social agreement for how we would like to manage fire under most conditions within any given pod. And those have proven useful for communicating with our partner agencies and private landowners in the area. So when a fire starts in any given pod, we can refer back to the map and say, oh, it's in a green maintain area, which can guide our initial response. Maybe not go too heavy and consider managing a fire for resource benefit. Whereas in like a protect zone, that's more or less a no-brainer to send the resources we need to suppress the fire before it does any damage. And so that effort initially took place in the winter of 2018 and 2019. And then in last winter, we collaborated with the Colorado State University and Colorado Forest Restoration Institute, CFRI, and Mike Caggiano and Ben Gannon. We started talking about how we could take pods to the next level. And so what we came up with was creating map books that included a lot of the baseline information from the quantitative risk assessment, as well as values at risk that we've identified that are important to display in maps at the pod scale. So we can have a quick snapshot of what is out there on the landscape when a fire starts, which can further help us guide management decisions or guide strategic decisions when we're considering how to manage a fire, what strategy to select. So it includes imagery and strategy overview, recent fire and fuels treatments, vegetation types, potential control line locations, suppression difficulty index, potential flame lengths, ownership and infrastructure, heritage, water, wildlife, and some general fire effects to the watershed and ecosystem. And so looking at this pod atlas, these are some examples of the information that is displayed. And it's really useful for line officers and fire managers to see what's out there on pod scale maps when a fire starts. And so we have some other maps to show everything that's in the map book. So the potential flame lakes, the suppression difficulty index, which displays more or less how difficult it would be to suppress a fire in certain locations. The potential control line locations, the cooler green colors, display where there's a high probability of stopping a fire within the pod. And then last, in the lower left-hand corner, there's the response function of water and ecosystem. So how watersheds and waterways would be affected by fire in that pod, and then how the ecosystem would respond theoretically to fire in the pod. And so we finalized our maps in 2019 with all the pods, and that was a year that was pretty darned wet. And so we had pretty moderate fire danger conditions that year. So it was a great year to manage fires for resource benefit. So to start with, we took these maps to cooperator meetings with our cooperator agencies and stakeholders to kind of just show them how we envision managing fire across the Forest Service landscape. And then when we got into practice, when we got into fire season, we used the pods to, more or less provide a gut check with the line officer about the strategy selection. So, a fire would start, folks would go out and recon it and say, this is a pretty good candidate for a resource benefit objective fire. And then they'd kind of go back and say, oh yeah, what color pod is it? Oh, it's in a yellow, restored, that is great. We also used pod boundaries to help define the WFDS planning areas. So WFDS planning area is more or less drawing a polygon around the fire vicinity, saying this is where we think that the fire could get to. And so drawing the planning area along a pod boundary is a good way to start tracing out where you're looking at values at risk to be considered. And then also we ended up using pod boundaries as actual control lines because they were already there, but those are generally like road systems, more or less no-brainers, but still useful. And then as we transitioned into 2020, we were more or less in a suppression strategy across both forests due to COVID because of the smoke and the exposure to personnel, to each other, I guess. We wanted to keep incidents small as much as possible. And that's where the pod atlas really came into play, because we were looking at a much higher fire danger year. So there's a lot more potential for extended attack fires. And so when we had fires that looked like they could expand into an extended attack scenario, we'd be able to find the fire location in the pod atlas and then get a quick snapshot of what the values at risk are out there and their proximity, as well as potential control line locations and the suppression difficulty index, which helps inform the tactics on the ground. Whether or not you'd want to try a direct suppression strategy versus going indirect and burning out. And that really came into play with the Medio fire, because when that started, as most of you well know, there's lots of values at risk, very close to the fire, and it was a great way to accelerate the decision making and talking with the resource specialists about what the values at risk were and how to protect them. So they could look at a map and then go back into GIS to verify the data layers. And it really accelerated developing a list of values at risk, as well as developing our incident objectives for the Medio fire. And then oddly enough, the fire perimeter for the Medio was about 40% of the control lines. Because in that country, there's not a whole lot out there that you can use to stop a fire that's burning intensely. So those, kind of after the fact, the pod boundaries definitely played a part in stopping the fire where we could. And I think that is all I have for this presentation. And I guess, Emily, if I have some time, are there any questions in the chat?
Yeah, so Rich, we did have a question in the chat, and it's regarding the maps. Is there a place that people can access those? In particular, we were getting questions about the Vallecitos Cañon Plaza area in the Western Carson, but how would people be able to access the PODS maps?
So those maps aren't, they're not publicly available. So I guess the best way to gain access to those would be to approach the local fire management. So if you're talking Vallecitos, I know there's many in New Mexico. If you're talking about near El Rito, then contact the local FMO.
The local FMO. Okay, great. Okay, and then what are the likelihood of pods being updated? How frequently do you think that happens?
We've been kind of sitting on them for the last 2 years to, I guess, see how they're working in practice. But we are planning to do an update. I've got to get an email out to the Forest Service folks to see if there's any reason to redelineate the pod boundaries or change any of the strategic response classifications due to prescribed or wildfire activity. So,
And one more question coming from the chat is, would the pods be able to possibly help advocate for more prescribed fire when the conditions allow in areas that are complex or difficult to manage, and when a wildfire happens, so it's not so difficult if and when that time comes?
okay, well, what I would say is that the decision process for whether or not to implement a prescribed burn is largely independent of what the pod classification is. In other words, fire management folks and agency administrators are looking at a whole slew of factors that are mostly environmental. The weather conditions, the fuel conditions, the ventilation rates, as to whether or not to implement a prescribed burn. Now, when it comes to planning prescribed burns, we've been talking about, I think that, well, I should say the classification of a pod can give some leverage to prioritizing planning out prescribed burns. So looking especially at high complexity areas, those are just a quick, easy reference to say, hey, this area has been classified as high complexity. We should probably start looking at, doing some sort of fuels treatment in that area, be it mechanical or with prescribed fire.
And I think that was the question of advocating for more prescribed burning. So yeah, great. Okay. And the next question is, has an economic analysis of the pod system been done comparing previous firefighting methods?
Ooh. I'm going to have to say that's probably above my pay grade. No, I don't believe there was no economic analysis tied to the pods analysis.
And okay, and Mike Caggiano is helping you out here, and he has told Tim that that hasn't been done yet. So thank you so much, Rich, for joining us today and helping us all see that pods is a lot more than drawing lines on a map, but something that can be really useful when these fires do occur.
Totally. Well, thank you guys.
Emily, it's back to you.
Great. Thanks, Mary, and thanks, Rich. All right, our next presentation is going to be from Ryan Ream. And Ryan is the Prescribed Fire Fuels Technician for the Santa Fe National Forest. And they will be speaking about the impact of prescribed burning and fuels treatment on fire suppression, lessons from the Medio fire.
Thank you, Emily.
And do you have a presentation?
I do. I have a PowerPoint here. I'm going to try to pull up.
Okay. Do you have a screen share button? Okay, great. I see it coming now.
Okay. Did that come up there for you guys?
Yes, it did. Although we do see on the one side, on the left side, the main slide, and then your next slide is showing on the right. So if there's a different mode, you can put it in. So we just see the one slide.
Okay.
Meanwhile, that's a really cute kid.
Thank you. That's my daughter. Okay, I don't know how to take this into presentation mode.
Let's see. Maybe under display settings there.
Ryan, if you stop sharing and then when you go back to share, I think you'll have an option to see the slide, not the preview window, and that may help.
Stop sharing and then go back to share screen. Or do I do it in PowerPoint?
There should be an option that says like PowerPoint slide, and it's just the slide, not the preview screen and the little preview window.
That would get the right one?
Excellent.
Yeah, looks great.
Okay, we got it. Okay, so yeah, I'm the prescribed fire fuels technician on the east side of the Santa Fe National Forest, so Espanola, Pecos. I also took over as the project lead on the Pacheco Canyon Forest Resiliency Project, and then I wiggled my way in as the division supervisor on the Medio fire when the team took over there. This first slide is my daughter here in Tesuque Creek drainage. The next drainage to the south from the Pacheco, or I mean the Medio fire. Next one over from Pacheco Canyon. And so it's a pretty important area to me. I go up there quite a bit. So the Medio fire started on August 17th. Conditions resembled what we usually see in June, and we were seeing them in August. As many of you know, we had about a week of monsoons, and then we didn't get any more precipitation. So our 1,000-hour fuels were in the single digits on the Espanola and Pecos. When I showed up on August 21st, this picture here off to the right is the power line going up. On the right side of that power line is the old Pacheco fire in 2011. I was also on that fire. We were starting a burnout operation off of the Pacheco fire and bringing that down to the Pacheco Rx that we did in 2019. That night we were getting 20-mile-an-hour winds out of the north, which was really unusual. Normally our winds are coming out of the southwest. Each day we were also getting thunderstorm activity and getting the outflows, but not the precipitation. The Medio fire burned 4,000 acres, like Rich said, in three main drainages: the Rio Nambe, the Rio en Medio, and Pacheco Canyon, which is actually Rio Chupadero. Values at risk, very heavy cultural sites for the Pueblo of Tesuque and the Nambe Pueblo. The Nambe Reservoir drainage and Nambe watershed, which got hit really hard at the Pacheco fire. The Santa Fe watershed to the south, the Santa Fe ski area, and the power line got hit pretty heavy from the Medio fire leading up to the ski area. The recreation areas, Aspen Vista, Big Tesuque, Hyde Park, and a forest network of trails. If we wouldn't have stopped the fire in Pacheco Canyon and it continued in the direction it was going, it would have ended up in Tesuque drainage, the next drainage over where the picture of my daughter was, and there's no containment lines in there. The next place to stop it would be on New Mexico 475, or many know it as the Hyde Park Road. To the west, you had homes in Pacheco Canyon and the villages of Chupadero and in Medio, pretty big communities. I wanted to mention the Greater Santa Fe Fireshed Coalition because they were a big part in a lot of the projects I work on. The Pacheco Canyon one that was responsible for the Pacheco RX that we did in 2019, the Hyde Park WE project, Santa Fe Watershed Protection Project, and then the Santa Fe Mountain Resiliency Project, which kind of ties in all of these projects. It's a collaboration of a bunch of different entities, from federal to state to nonprofit and tribal. This is showing these projects as well as some of the main fires that have happened on the west side of the Sangres. And you'll notice that most of these fires are started within that band of historic frequent fire, ponderosa pine. between the pinyon juniper in the lower country and then the mixed conifer in the high country. And that's where we're also targeting. You notice the Pacheco Canyon Forest Resiliency Project here. We started on this project location because the 102 road goes through that canyon and it's a pretty high recreation area. And then we have the Hyde Park down here in the Santa Fe. And you'll notice the Santa Fe Mountains Resiliency Project ties in all these projects on the west side of the Sangres. When this Santa Fe Mountain Lands comes online, the first place I'd like to go to is down here into Suke Creek, and then burning on the north side of the Hyde Park Road. That would tie in these projects, and then burning in Cañada de los Alamos. And with a few projects, then we have gotten treatment tied in on the southwest side of the Sangres here to protect these high value recreation areas and keep fire from getting up into the higher elevation areas. So this is the Pacheco Canyon Forest Resiliency Project. You'll notice the 102 road going through the middle of the map here. This pink blob up here at the top on the northeast side of the map is the 2019 Pacheco RX that we did. It was a collaboration of the Tesuque Pueblo and the state, New Mexico Game and Fish, and I think the All Hands All Lands may have been on that fire. I'm not sure, but it was a very good prescribed burn. We did it kind of on the wetter side because it wasn't treated, it hasn't been thinned at all. So we were utilizing fire to thin. As all these canyons on the west side of the Sangres, they drain east-west. So your southern facing slopes on the northern side of the canyon are predominantly ponderosa pine, and we can use prescribed fire to at a low prescription to thin these this side of the canyons. You get onto the southern side of the canyons, you get into more mixed con, generally an overstory of ponderosa pine and then really thick mixed conifer understory. So on the southern side of the canyon, we've got three, we've actually got more now, but three thinning units. We're getting ready this winter to burn this unit 1, and then we just thinned this fall this unit 2. The Pueblo is thinned their land here. So once we get these piles burned, then we can introduce broadcast burning on the south side of the canyon. The ridge lines, you'll notice, have fuel breaks. The south side here, we use mastication to thin the ridges. And then on the north side of the canyon here, it was a little more rugged terrain. We did a cut and pile. And we did actually use this fuel break on the north side of the canyon during the Medio fire as a containment line to burn off of, to contain the stuff that was still down in the Rio Medio. This slide on this picture on the left here is the 2019 Pacheco RX, and the one on the right is the unit that just to the west of where the Medio fire came down. You can see definitely the fuel loading. The crown heights are a lot lower, definitely. And then we thinned out some of this understory vegetation, ladder fuels. This is a picture on the left is looking down into Rio and Medio. You can see some of the high severity fire that burned with the crown runs coming up out of Rio and Medio. And right behind that picture is the picture on the right looking into the fuel break that we put in, and we burned those piles in winter of 2019, so right before the Rio and Medio fire. So this fire was in alignment with the north winds. Also, the south side of Rio and Medio is north facing, so you had that thicker mixed con. That fire was all in alignment, came up there, pretty high severity out of Rio and Medio, hit the fuel break, and went from an active crown fire to a surface fire. It did spot about halfway down into Pacheco Canyon. This is the fire progression map on the right. So the first few days, the fire was in Rio Nambe and Rio and Medio. It made some high severity runs coming up out of Rio Nambe, spotted into Rio and Medio. Had a couple runs coming up both sides of Rio and Medio. It did spot on August 21st. That was the day I got there. It spotted down here in this area in Pacheco Canyon. We were able to utilize that night the old Pacheco fire from 2011 and bring fire down the Borrego Trail and tie fire in that day with that night with the Pacheco RX. So it gave us a tie-in point for our burnout operation that night, and then the next day we were able to do two things. We were able to bring fire, two different hotshot crews were able to bring fire along the north side of the Pacheco RX, and they were able to burn off of the west side of the Pacheco RX to keep the fire in Pacheco Canyon even, so it couldn't do any crown runs and possibly spot on the south side of Pacheco Canyon, if that makes sense. So we were able to keep that fire even long enough. We were actually able to go direct off of the 102 road and bring line up to the fuel break. That was a couple days later. And then we were able to burn off of the fuel break going west until we found a ridge adequate to bring fire down into the bottom of the canyon. So the Pacheco RX, without having to do any prep work ahead of time, we were able to burn off the edge of that prescribed burn in pretty severe conditions. And we did get several spot fires, but they were no bigger than 1/10 of an acre in the Pacheco RX. And then the fuel break gave us a ready-made containment line that would have taken the hotshot crews a lot. We wouldn't have had enough time to stay ahead of that fire without the fuel break in the Pacheco RX. This is the burn severity, the bark map. And you can see these high severity patches where it came up out of Rio Nambe, and then it got down into Rio and Medio. It came up the north side of the Rio and Medio, and it came up the south side of Rio and Medio up to the ridge line. And then everything down in Pacheco Canyon was low severity. In fact, a lot of it didn't even read on the bark map. So the lessons learned from this was fuel treatments in Pacheco Canyon provided fire crews with ready-made containment lines and a break in the fuel to safely and successfully stop the continued progress of the Medio fire. We were without doing any prep work ahead of doing our burnout operations. We were able to do those burnout operations in a relatively little amount of time. The reduction of fuel resulting from the Pacheco RX kept the fire from progressing to the Tsuke watershed. I don't think we would have had time to prep and do that burnout operations with the fire as close as it was without the Pacheco RX and the fuel break. And most likely it would have ended up on the south side of Pacheco, which isn't fully treated. We still had piles that hadn't been burnt. It most likely would have ended up in the Tsuke drainage where there are no containment lines. Fire went from an active crown fire to a surface fire when it reached the fuel break. Definitely it spotted down in Pacheco Canyon, but it slowed it down once it reached the top. It fell back on the ground. Most wildfire activity occurs within the band of historically frequent fire forest. So that's where we are focusing our treatment efforts, much like the Pacheco fire. And the Medio fire illustrates the overall importance of our continued fuels reduction efforts and a reintroduction of fire. And that concludes my presentation.
Great, thank you so much.
Yeah, okay. In terms of the questions, Ryan, I have one for you, which is, we've been seeing somewhere between 40 to 80% of these large wildfires that are burning, you know, in these really hot times, be in that moderate to high category. Looking at your bark map, do you happen to know what the percentage of the moderate and high categories were? Because it looks like, you know, these landscape treatments are beginning to maybe move that needle a little bit more towards lower fire behavior.
Yeah, I do have that. Give me a second. I don't remember what they are off the top of my head, but I did put them in a report I did here. Yeah, as you can see, those high severity patches in Rio and Medio, they were where the fire was in alignment, and most of those patches were only about 100 acres, so it wasn't as bad as it could have been. 16% of the fire area burned high severity, 13% was moderate, and 49% was low or didn't register. I know firsthand, being on the ground there, that the areas that it didn't register actually did burn as low intensity. It just didn't pick up on the bark map. So 49% of it burned low severity.
And Julianne has gotten that information into the chat. So thank you there, Julianne.
Oh, okay, good. Thanks, Julie.
And then, yeah, it's great. And I know you shared your report with us, and I'm wondering, did we get that put on a website? I know I passed it around. But if not, we'll try to get that up in a place where it's available for everyone.
Mm-hmm. And I just mentioned that fuel break that I was talking about, that was actually put in there to be the containment line for our next prescribed burn. So, you know, these fuel breaks, they kind of meet dual roles. And as I say, fuel breaks, it was just a small diameter thinning treatment that we did on the ridge line as a cut and pile. And they provide ready-made containment lines for when we have these fires like this start, and they are containment lines for our prescribed burns. And we'll be utilizing these fuel breaks for the burns that we do in the Tasuke drainage once the Santa Fe Mountain Lands is up online as well.
And Porfirio asked if you have any thoughts on the necessity to continue the maintenance burns on these acres. And
oh, definitely. Definitely. Yeah. The Santa Fe watershed, though, all those units in the Santa Fe watershed are in maintenance now. It's about every 8 years. So we just have got them all on a rotation, and we'll just continue putting the Pacheco and the Santa Fe Mountain Lands on a rotation once we get fire reintroduced into those.
Will that apply to the Medio fire as well?
Oh, definitely. Yeah. The Medio, a big portion of the Medio is in the Santa Fe Mountain Lands footprint. So,
right.
Yes, once that comes back around to needing maintenance, we'll do that as well.
All right. Well, thank you very much, Ryan. We really appreciate it. And Emily, it's back to you.
Great. Thanks, Mary, and thanks, Ryan, for a great presentation. All right, our next presenters are Dave Lasky and Daniel Godwin with the Forest Stewards Guild. And Dave is the Director of Fire Management for the Guild. And Daniel, correct me if I get this wrong, Daniel, you're the Associate Director of Fire Management for the Guild. and they will be speaking
Awesome.
about prescribed fire and COVID concerns.
Great, thanks, Emily. And before I get started, I'm just going to do some shameless promotion. Hopefully everybody can see my hat, Prescribed Fire Council hat. I think Doug Boykin will happily tell us there's still inventory to be bought. So come down to the Prescribed Fire Council's website and get a hat. At least Emily's smiling. Most everybody else doesn't have their video on. But I am going to hopefully successfully share my screen. All right. And then let's see here. Emily, can you, I just need a little feedback to make sure everybody can actually see the screen.
I can see it, but if you could put it in presentation mode, that would be better.
Yeah, that's what I'm trying to do here. Great. All right, hopefully everybody can see that.
Yep, I think there's just a little lag on the video, but it's catching up here, so I think you're good to go.
Great. Fantastic. Well, Daniel and I would like to talk a little bit about COVID and prescribed fire. And I want to start by saying I think this is a very complex issue. Some of the issues I at least have strong opinions about, and I will do my best to not overstretch on being opinionated. And I also really want to set the stage by saying each agency that we've talked to or worked with in the last six months has come to this issue, I think, slightly differently, but with a lot of thought and a lot of diligence. And I think as we've seen, as we are confronting the greatest public health crisis in 100 years, there aren't any easy right answers. And so I do want to just really acknowledge, I think, all of the practitioners in New Mexico who are doing both suppression and prescribed fire have worked really hard to try and make sense of a really challenging period in time. So one of the things that we certainly have looked at a lot and continue to struggle with is we do prescribe fire for a number of reasons, a number of good reasons, but certainly one of the primary ones is as a preventative technique to reduce fuel loads and hopefully reduce the impact of catastrophic prescribed fire. And so I think there's a very challenging ethical question about whether or not we view prescribed fire as an essential activity in the same way that we view suppression fire. Obviously, there are some legal implications in terms of trying to adhere to county and state mandates as it pertains to COVID, but I think the more challenging issue is, depending on how you come down on the issue, are we essentially putting tomorrow's fires out today by doing an essential activity of a prescribed fire? So we struggle with that issue. I don't have a good answer. I hope we'll have a healthy conversation about that perhaps at the end of the presentation. But what we are able to do is first and foremost look at whether or not we can keep our fire practitioners safe. And we've been able to lean heavily on the safety protocols that were developed by our suppression fire colleagues. And it appears that many of those protocols, like distanced briefings, sanitation, digital IAPs, all of those things appear to have worked well. One of the major techniques, though, that that suppression utilized was this concept of a module as one, and essentially treating a hand crew or an engine as an independent, isolated entity. And what we've seen is that the operational realities for prescribed fire make that module as one implementation hard to do. Sometimes it's hard to do because prescribed fires are shorter duration, so we've got practitioners sleeping at home. And then other times it's hard to do because prescribed fires oftentimes don't have the same degree of resource that a suppression event does. So we've not been able to utilize the module as a COVID mitigation technique. And again, that's been a challenge. I'd be curious to hear how other practitioners have addressed it. But one of the things we've also looked very closely at is evaluating really our operations in a broader public health context for both the practitioner and in terms of public safety. And so we start by looking at just basically how strained is the medical system and asking ourselves, can we or should we be working? And again, I don't have great guidance about whether when a county is in higher risk or highest risk, that should be the cutoff for operations, but I think it's an important evaluation point. In a similar vein, we do try and evaluate overall hospital bed loads and ICU impacts. And as we've really drilled down on our protocols, we look at the fact that, as we say oftentimes in fire, driving is the most dangerous thing that we'll do. And obviously our choice to drive to a prescribed fire both risks our practitioner, but also provides a risk for everybody else on the road. And so, again, it is hard to always accurately analyze how dangerous the drive is to your fire, how important that fire may or may not be. But again, I think it is an important thing to try and evaluate and build some internal metrics around. The other thing that I think all practitioners are really beginning to confront, and we've tried to make some progress on, is that, if smoke wasn't already a big enough issue for us, there's now good science that smoke is a contributing factor to the impact of a COVID infection. And there's been some interesting additional research around it's not just what smoke does to an individual with an infection, but what smoke encourages people to do when there is smoke. So, for example, we tell people, if you're smoke sensitive, shelter inside, close your windows. And obviously activities like that, if it's outside of your household, we know have the chance of increasing COVID infection rates. We're also doing, as we often do, trying to distinguish that not all smoke is the same. And we've doubled down on trying to both measure and manage our smoke and really looking at duration and quantity. And these are not new techniques or tactics for fire managers, but we've certainly looked at the opportunities to get some work done, but try and perhaps throttle back the quantity of smoke. And so are there opportunities to do 50 piles instead of 500? And then finally, we are looking at the idea that smoke is certainly a social justice issue and has been for a long time, but particularly when we know COVID impacts populations unequally due to social vulnerability, and smoke impacts populations unequally to social vulnerability, we're really trying to analyze that kind of double whammy, if you will. And so this is some of the research that we looked at. The Harvard University School of Public Health and others looked and are essentially connecting what we know about PM 2.5 in a non-wildfire smoke context, linking that to the fact that we know a lot of wildfire smoke is PM 2.5, and then coming to the conclusion that, that we understand that our smoke is having an impact. And so where that leads us really is where we used to ask, is this the right fire in the right place at the right time? I think we now have to ask, why this fire in this place at this time? And there are a couple of techniques that we're trying to use to answer that question. The first certainly is many of the techniques that we've used previously, like smoke mapping and modeling, looking at where our smoke receptors are and just making a fairly coarse level assessment of, are we going to have a smoke impact? But there are also a number of new tools that are out there that we've been utilizing and I think folks should be aware of. One is this tool that's been created by the Interagency Wildland Fire folks, looking at how we can regionally track both COVID and air quality. And it produces products like this slide here that looks at baseline PM 2.5 levels and infection rates, overlays them there. And for those of you who have good eyesight, you can see both Santa Fe and Taos clump kind of in the center there of the big blue clumping. And out of that, I'm going to now turn this over to Daniel. Out of that, we've developed some more specific tools.
Yeah, thanks, Dave. If you want to just click it forward. And I'm not sure if everybody's seeing these blocks on their screen there where it's hard to see the side of it. So what I may do here is there one of them disappeared for you. Okay, so this is a spreadsheet that I've knocked together for us to help with decision support. And the caveat here, I'm not a public health professional, nor do I play one on TV. But just looking at the literature and talking to people that are smarter than me, thinking about how to look at the factors that go into our decision making, I think about COVID caseload. I think about fatality rate. I think about social vulnerability index, which I'm going to circle back to in a little bit. And I think about how much smoke we're putting out there in a given event. So if I'm trying to build a risk matrix here, social vulnerability index is a tool that has been developed that looks at a number of different factors for a given population, and it's generally at the census block group level that looks at their population's economic challenges that they face. You know, if there's a higher poverty rate in that area, their access to transportation. And so if you have a poor access to transportation or a low car ownership rate, or there's not good public transportation in that location, you're not able to move away from smoke effectively. It looks at the age distribution, so how many vulnerable individuals there are, whether they be young people or old people. There's also, it weighs in access to medical care. There's a whole lot of stuff stacked into this. And then it just gives you an index number that you can compare these different areas for. And so you can plug that into this risk matrix. And then if we go at each project and we think about, okay, how much potential smoke could we be sticking out there on just a scale of 1 to 5, 1 being short grass and 5 being, you know, heavy mastication or lots of dead and down or something like that. We can start throwing some numbers onto here. And then if you click forward here, Dave, one more time, we can then chart this in a normalized way. And so if we have our x-axis here, which is our COVID-19 case rate, 0 being lowest, 5 being highest, and normalized social vulnerability, 0 being lowest, 5 being highest. In this upper corner here, this upper right-hand corner in the red, that's where you've got both things overlapping, right? You have high caseloads and high social vulnerability. And then the size of the dots on the projects is the relative fuel load. So if you got a big circle in that upper right-hand corner, that's a red flag, right? Because you've got an area where you've got a lot of people that are at risk, a lot of people that are sick, and you're potentially dumping a lot of smoke in there. Whereas if you're in this lower left-hand corner where you have a low case rate, low social vulnerability index rate, and you're not putting up a lot of smoke, then that's probably your comfort zone right now. In these other two yellow boxes, that's where it gets a little squishier, right? And fire management decision making is never easy or straightforward. And I feel like we live in the squishy zones often. And then you just kind of need to weigh your costs and benefits within these. Part of our thought process too, like Dave talked about, is mobilization time. How much are we going to have to travel? And that's going to affect our what our risk of putting someone into an already overstressed hospital could be. But then, you know, if you are only doing work in low social vulnerability index sites, then you may be only benefiting wealthier populations with the work that you're doing. And so you can kind of flip this argument on its head. And so I think those are things we need to be considering. And I don't have a good answer there, honestly, because Powell County, Montana, and Larimer County, Colorado are better off in a lot of ways. And that's why their social vulnerability index is low. So this has been a tool that's helped us think about this and provide a little bit of decision support, but it doesn't necessarily make the decisions for us. There's still that person in the middle who has to make these decisions. So I think that's what we've been trying to use so far, and we're continuing to refine this. And I'll hand it back over to Dave. I think you're still muted there, Dave.
Sorry. I was going to say, I'm going to stop the share there, and I'll kick it back to either Emily or Mary.
All right, so we do have some questions for you from the chat. One of the questions was if you could post in the chat your interagency COVID site. But Barb is asking about the placement of smoke monitors and if that's improved or changed. For example, she was saying comparing prescribed burn smoke and wildfire smoke has been challenging in the past because the prescribed relies on the permanent smoke monitors, while extra smoke monitors are placed for wildfire. And so effective placement seems like it would better reveal the overlap with the COVID cases. Any thoughts there?
Yeah, I certainly agree. I think better placement would be a big help. In, you know, what we're doing primarily is trying to look at this predictively and decide really, and perhaps I did not do a great job of articulating this. Really, for us, the whole process here is to build decision support tools that allow us to do a go, no go, and whether or not we even want to commit to putting fire on the ground. I would certainly agree once we do, we still have a deficiency in good smoke monitoring. One of the things that we're looking at, we've yet to use, but we have really good feedback from the health department in Colorado, is the Purple Air system, which is kind of a citizen scientist air monitoring program. So I think that would be, once we get back to burning, hopefully this spring at greater volume, I think Barb's points are very well taken. Daniel, any other additional thoughts?
Well, we have an additional question. Alan Hook is asking, Daniel, recognizing that you're not a health representative or air quality specialist, however, has your data been shared with the appropriate state air quality bureaus or Department of Health departments?
Yeah, thanks, Alan. I have worked with a couple of public health professionals on this, as well as shared this with the smoke or the prescribed fire smoke liaison here in Colorado, Boyd Labita, and he thinks it's as good a tool as anything else that's out there, because we're all kind of somewhat making this up as we go along. That's the challenge of working in a once in 100-year pandemic like this.
And Will is also asking you if you can post a link to the social vulnerability index as well. as well as telling you it was an excellent presentation.
Well, thanks, Will. I'll throw that in the chat box here.
Okay, and I believe time-wise, we probably need to just keep pushing. So back to you, Emily.
All right, great. Thank you, Mary. Thanks, Dave and Daniel. It was a fantastic presentation. All right, our next presentation is from Doug Cram with New Mexico State University Extension, and Doug will be presenting on science and knowledge update in prescribed burning.
All right, hold on for a second. All right, let me see if I can share my screen. All right, Emily, and let's see if we can go to. Here we go. Emily, how's that look?
I'm just giving it 1 second to catch up. There it goes. Looks great to me, Doug.
Thanks. All right, thanks everybody for joining us. The Extension Forest and Fire Specialist at New Mexico State University. Also on the board with the Southwest Fire Science Consortium, so we appreciate their support today. And they asked me to talk about science and prescribed fire. I thought perfect. And again, that makes me think of the consortium. They are also enjoy living in the science world, and as Barb mentioned earlier, interacting with managers and science and beyond. So let's jump right into that. So this wasn't a scientific experiment, but as many of us have often done, so I jumped on Google and punched in quote prescribed fire. So we had those 2 exact words, and we get 1.7 million hits. That seems good, but if you compare that to grazing, when I did it last night, I got 1 billion hits. When I did it this morning, it's only 100 million, but either way, that makes the point. I guess grazing has been around a long time, but prescribed fire or controlled burn, not so much. We're kind of new in the science world. And I really like this picture. So I've showed it before of Dr. Harold Biswell in California. Let me get my laser pointer on here. Right, this is, I think we can all wish for these days where clearly no one's wearing PPE, and I don't think they need to for that matter. But right there, what we could a science extension type of opportunity field trip where in 1969 is talking about fire and basically supported by science. So I also sort of dove into Google Scholar and looked at prescribed fire. 48,000 hits, and if you just look in 2000 or 2020, I should say, there's 2,000 hits, and so on and so forth. So there's a lot of science out there, but we're kind of just getting started in terms of prescribed fire. One analogy, I remember when I was taking a plants class from Dr. Allred, he said, in the United States we just have we have the dandelion, but in the UK, for example, where they have not much land area and a lot of extra time on their hands apparently. They've, identified 2,000 variations of the dandelion. So that's kind of where we are. We have a lot of fire science, but not a whole lot of prescribed fire science. And one more example of that, so I'm not going to talk much about rangeland science in prescribed fire today, but there's this great publication from Sam Fullendorf et al. From my colleagues over at my alma mater at Oklahoma State. And they looked at, again, rangeland practices. And the title of their chapter 2 is Assessment of Prescribed Fire as a Conservation Practice. So they found 474 papers. And as a side note, between 67 and 89, there are only 10 papers they found. And then starting in the year 2000, there are 20 plus papers a year. So this is good for, practitioners as well as managers, right? This idea that we're building more science to help us on the ground. Yeah, so check out this. Well, one of the thought, it'd be nice if we put together one of these for the forestry world, and that there probably exists, but anyways. So if you'll bear with me, I think many of you probably had the same experience this late summer, early fall when California and when the West Coast was on fire. I hesitate to use burning. I like to use burning for prescribed burning, right? But we started seeing all these headlines. And so I'm going to go through a few of these. New York Times, August, California fires want to control blazes. Start more, experts say. From NPR in October, experts to Western states. Time to finally fight wildfires with more fire. U.S. Forest Service Research Station, thinning and prescribed fire treatments reduce tree mortality. MIT, surely there's some science there, right? Suppression fires has failed. Here's what California needs to do instead, and not to be outdone. Here's Stanford's response. Setting fires to avoid fires. Stanford study outlines approaches to enable more prescribed burns. Radio.com, that's from the Bay Area. From an expert, devastating fire season shows need for prescribed burns, and so forth and so on. I thought this one was interesting. Amid devastating U.S. fires, experts urge fire prevention rethink. Calls grow for state and national prescribed burn strategies to prevent repeat of huge wildfires in Western states. Oh, that's Al Jazeera. That's interesting. So, I guess they have a Mediterranean climate. And this last one, again, obviously, I just typed in prescribed fire news and then started copying headlines. And I copied this one and pasted it. It's like, oh, it's in all caps, but well, I should read it first, right? Pendleton Fire Department uses prescribed fire to help environment, prevent wildfires. It's like, oh, I need to change that. Oh, no, wait, that's the Marine Corps. That's perfect. So from the New York Times to the Marine Corps, there's lots of folks out there that are recognizing the value of prescribed fire. And I'm going to come back to that. A few other headlines. This one from ProPublica. They know how to prevent mega fires. Why wouldn't anybody listen? Now here's this, they say, right, ProPublica is a nonprofit newsroom that investigates abuses of power. So it stands to reason we're going to kind of have these loud headlines, if you will. I'll come back to that one. This one from The Atlantic. Land managers can't burn the West fast enough. Prescribed burns, which create buffers against large fires, can only do so much. And so, as we've been hearing some great stories about prescribed fire today, but these two, well, certainly this one reminds me, and again, I'm speaking to the choir here, right? We shouldn't overpromise and underdeliver. As this one says, prescribed fires can only do so much. But if we saw, again, all those last headlines, you'd think, man, this is the silver bullet. And many of us think it's certainly headed in that direction. But that's just one thing to think about when the public's reading all these headlines, and then one like this, they know how to prevent megafires, right? I sort of laugh, like, as prescribed fire practitioners, man, we need more megafires. We just don't need the severity of high severity. If we had a megafire that was low, predominantly low severity and a little bit of moderate, and maybe a dash of a high, right, that'd be fine. So the megafire, the size isn't the problem, it's the way fires behave. So anyways, and then here, this is kind of a snarky headline from the USA Today. California residents didn't want controlled burns near their homes. Some of these homes burned. Some of these homes then burned in a wildfire. You can ask Barb. She showed us that picture of her, burning around her home. That doesn't mean her home is, inherently resilient to embers. So anyways, it's just kind of fun to go through these headlines. I will point out that 20 years ago, this last summer was Cerro Grande. It was the U.S. News headline, and some other ones. Also, of course, our State Forester Laura McCarthy told us about our State Prescribed Fire Act, and here's the U.S. Senate trying to cut in on our headlines. But there has been in September, Senate Bill 4625, the National Prescribed Fire Act. So, yeah, again, this is a lot based on science. One more, sorry if you bear with me, headlines. We saw a lot of these as well at the same time. Sort of native prescribed fire. To manage wildfire, California needs to know what tribes have known all along. Some of that might be a little bit overstated, but we get the point there. California Native American tribes have been burning forests for 10,000 years. What can we learn? Again, things like the New York Times. I think there's one from the Wall Street Journal. Here's one, last one. There's a 60,000-year-old way to help stop Australia burning. So again, this idea of cultural use of fire and appreciation there. Okay, so what's that have to do with science? well, a lot of that, especially that first slide I showed you, is I like to present this study from Martinston and Omi in 2013. This is a meta-analysis, not to be confused with the mega fire, but a meta-analysis where they looked at 19 different studies that basically looked to try and change fire severity. So on this scale down here on the X, I guess the more negative the number, the greater the change from what the the greater the change in fire severity. And so this inverse J, we get a little bang for our buck down here on these black circles. We see over here that this is harvesting conifer and prescribed fire. So that makes sense. But again, the science bears this out. So I think my point is, I think all those headlines are kind of based on this science right in here. And there have been many more since 2013. And we got some of those great presentations from, for example, Ryan this morning and the PAWS presentation, really looking at, we've seen that this really does, it's not just a science exercise, but we see that changing fire severity. This actually is another piece of science from Honig and Foulet in 2012. But actually, they didn't look at fire at all, but it kind of tells a story. They just looked at fuel treatments. So up here, critical fire weather, 80, 90, 97 percentile. And these colors indicate crown fraction burned. So the more red it is, the more of the crown that burned. And so in an untreated scenario, right, we have more crown fire. And then a 10-inch cap, a 16-inch cap, or a full restoration, right, we have less crown burning. And I think we could add in prescribed fire in there as well and expect to see the same sort of results. Okay, so here is I picked out one publication that caught my eye. This is from 2020 from Levin et al., although Scott Stevens here, the last author. This is from their fire and fire surrogate work out in California. I forget the name of is it the Blodgett? Yeah, their research forest out there. I wish we had one of those here in New Mexico. It's based on a fire and fire surrogate. We're actually doing one here in the Sacramento Mountains. It's part of research I'm involved with. But that basic experimental design is prescribed fire and mechanical harvest. So you have control, no fire, no thinning. We'll skip to, if you have no fire, but just thinning, right, harvest only. And then, yes, thinning and yes, burning, harvest and burn. But this one here is what this paper focuses on, the burn only. So this actually is our study site. It's kind of what that looks like. We have a north and south aspect, all those different treatments. And of course, that's replicated 3 times. So going back to the Levin and Scott Stevens paper, sort of calibrate our eye. So this was in 2002. They have this pretty detailed evidence that there have been no fires nor treatments on this site. This is a mixed conifer site. Again, the Sierra Nevadas, somewhat applicable to what we have here in the Southwest, somewhat mixed conifer dry sites. So 2002, this is what it looked like. And then, so again, on the burn only, like the idea is, hey, fire used to be part of these systems. Let's put fire back in. Let's just use fire. And this is post-fire. This is what it looked like. And so the first, if you were a graduate student at the time, a master's student, right, you studied for 2 years, the conclusion would be, well, we didn't torch out the stand. Of course, it was a prescribed fire. We didn't want to do that. But we didn't really change a whole lot of stand structure. And so, but the cool part again about this paper is, wow, we're looking at a second entry here. So in 2009, about, 7 years later, so all the fires were conducted in October, let's say about October 1, with the same humidity, the same wind speeds, and the same 10-hour fuel moisture of about 5 to 10% on those 10 hours. So again, this is what it looked like, 6 years after the fire? Well, after this photograph, right? And so we see a shrub component starting to come back in, but not, a little bit of, well, sometimes it's the light, right? But we see maybe actually a little bit of structure change from 2002 to 2009. But do our second entry fire, and that's what that looked like. This is probably taken the next spring. Well, yeah, here in 2010. And then cool, like we're getting to 2017. So now we got our third entry, and this is what it looks like before the fire, pre-fire in 2017. And then of course, after the fire in the spring of 2018, burn in 17. fire taken in 18. So again, this is just using our eye, but we can start to see why we are seeing some structural changes here. I should note, look at these $1,000 fuels that have been added following the first and second fire. And so maybe jumping ahead here, because I'm going to show some data next, but we often hear the story of, we got into this predicament, if you will, over a course of 100 years, or sometimes I like to think of 50 years between the big burn of 1910 and back to Biswell in 1960, about 50 years there, full, fires in the tool. Either way, 50, 100 years, whatever it may be, we're like, it's gonna take a while to get out of it. But actually, here's some interesting evidence in sort of a narrative that, in a career, half a career, about 15 to 20 years, let's just say, with the reintroduction of 3 fires, well, I'm getting ahead of myself. We're starting to see a return to maybe what we might call a maintenance situation, which I heard Ryan talk about earlier. So here's, we're supposed to be talking about science here. Here's some of that data. This is the burn number. So this is cool, the first, second, and third burn, looking at consumption of surface fuels, Duff, litter, 1, 10, 100, etc. And so the trend you see here, these are the box and whisker plot. So this is the mean. These are the quartiles that on these boxes here, the third and the first, and then kind of the range. The dots are outliers. But the idea here is, well, it's just looking at Duff. The first fire consumes 75% of the pre-burn fuel, and second fire about the same, little bit wider range, there in terms of response. And then this third one, not as much consumption. Okay, that kind of makes sense there, really. Like, right, there's less fuel to consume, and sure enough, that's the way these graphs are falling out. So there's the more variability here in the 110, but again, those things, those fuels have, they hold more moisture. You start adding in slope, microsites, and they tend to behave a little bit differently than these pretty homogeneous fuels in the 1 and 10. And so, and here is some really cool sort of way of graphically depicting, again, consumption based on it's a log scale, but normalized, but it's total fuel load. So again, what we see is these first 2 fires are really kind of on top of each other, indicating basically the more fuel there was, the more consumption there was. But then we see this, it's still the same slope, right? But it's a different intercept. But it's telling us, again, this sort of these, and they burn these, I'd say, relatively hot, if you will. You can't quantify that, but they consumed, obviously, they're trying to consume a lot of this fuel. It wasn't like when we burned ours and mixed conifer and the sacks, I didn't want to, there's some trepidation as well, like we haven't done this before, let's not torch this stand, but pretty good consumption in burns 1 and 2. But again, these burns are all designed the same way, same weather. And sure enough, here on this third burn, kind of this maintenance type of a signature, right? It's consuming less fuel because basically there's less consuming. Again, we're kind of getting into this maintenance type situation. So there's some cool scientific evidence that, after 3 entries, we're starting to see some interaction between the first, second, and third burn. And as we heard, some maintenance type of approach. Now, one more graph from that study. So again, here's the first, so let's look at our scales. Percent basal area in pine, again, normalized in the log scale. And then again, fuel consumption over here on the Y. And so that first one actually has this negative slope to it, different intercepts. And that, if I can explain that here in 1 minute accurately, again, check out the paper. It goes into some interesting hypotheses on some of these interactions. But the first time you burn it, right, there's a lot of white fur, for example. It hasn't been any fire in here for a long time. You saw that picture, a lot of buildup of non-fire tolerant species. And so actually the more pine you had, the less consumption you had, because there was a lot of other, or the percent of pine, right? There's a lot of other species here and so that fuel consumption was reduced. But cool, check out the second one in the third fire. Again, positive slopes, but a little bit different, actually, well, the degree of the slope, right, and the intercept. But again, telling us, so the more, after you get rid of some of those white fur, for example, on that second and third entry, right, we're actually consuming, the more pine you have, the more consumption you get. Of course, the third one is reduced because we've removed some of those fuels. It's kind of this idea of this maintenance type burn. Again, we're not, it's right where, if you were, it's consuming about, basically the fuel, about 25%, 30% of that fuel since the last burn. So again, this cool idea of, we're not quite there, I'd say, in the West on a large scale. The Gila might be an example where I know they've had multiple entries. We did some cool with the consortium. Look on their website. We have 2 videos focusing on the Black Range, looking at this idea of multiple of entries. So, and in the Southeast for sure, where I did some of my work in the Ouachitas in Oklahoma, they're burning some sites every year or every 2 or 3 years. We're just happy, like as Zayton was talking about, man, we got a first entry burn, we're excited. But looking down the road with these prescribed fire bills and all this science and these headlines, hopefully we're kind of headed in this direction of multiple entry burns where we're trying to see, we're getting the results that we really want to see. How are we doing on time? Okay, not bad. So subsequent fire behavior, this is also, again, from Scott Stevens' work, not necessarily from that paper, but from, if you went to his website as the PI of the Fire and Fire Surrogate, Sierra Nevadas, just looking at these results. So the first time they burned it, they saw reduced fire behavior, again, after 1 entry, prescribed fire. The second time, they actually have some increased surface fuels. So, there's some moderate increase in fire behavior. That's maybe not what we want. But then again, in this third one, reduced behavior and kind of this idea of fire resilient landscapes. And so some of these other ones are interesting as well, especially this one, mechanical fire. By this third time, increased fire behavior following shrub growth. Now that's not the whole story necessarily, but I just remember when these studies first came out, the Fire and Fire Surrogate, it was like, oh, mechanical in the fire is definitely the way to go. And we saw some science earlier that indicates, yes, we can change fire behavior, but it's interesting. The initial response to fire only was, well, it's a pretty slow tool. We really need to do some thinning. And this reminds me, Mary can appreciate this. After the 2002 Rodeo Chesky fire, if we looked at the headlines after that fire, and some of you remember this, there was just megaphone calls for like, we have to, this is because lawsuits and environmental groups that prevented thinning, we have to log the forest. And I'm not saying we don't need to, that's a part of it, right? But it's interesting, fast forward 20 years later, and we're seeing, wow, we can actually change some structure with just fire alone. Okay, so I'm not going to go through these. This is the mechanical plus fire pictures. And again, this is a small subset. They went in and saw that they're getting a much more fuel here. They did some mastication, burned it again. So you can check that out on your own. Here's their mechanical only pictures. All right, so one more piece of science. This is from from our Association of Fire Ecology, a relatively new journal. Again, relatively speaking, Andy Thode has helped organize this effort, getting a well, it's a fire ecology journal, but there's a lot of prescribed fire in there. So this article, Rod Lynn up in Los Alamos is one person from the Southwest doing some physics fire modeling. Prescribed fire science, the case for basically what we need in the future. So I'm calling this future prescribed fire science. And this kind of summarizes what the paper talks about: fundamental differences in fire behavior characteristics between prescribed fires and wildland fires. So we need new fire models, new smoke dispersion tools, ecosystem process models capable of capturing variation and complexity of prescribed fires to meet objectives. Back to that dandelion example, right? We have a lot of fire traditionally focused on, or science focused on wildfire, but now we're like, we have sort of the time and space. Let's dive into prescribed fire and see what's there. So for example, again, the models, as you wildland fire practitioners know, it's like we have limited time. We have a fire that starts and we're just gonna let this model run and burn. Well, that's obviously not what we're doing in prescribed fires. So there's some nuances there between these models of predicted wildland fire behavior versus prescribed fire behavior. And back to Rod's, well, I got his paper here in a minute, using a fire physics model. He originally was looking at prescribed fire, but, pardon me, wildland fire, very computer intensive program, but now he's come up with a one that's more suitable for prescribed fire. Another point, moving from 2D to 3D and even 4D. What's 4D fuel characterization? That's this idea of actually having a model that can change fuel moisture, during the day. As you start your backfire at 10 in the morning with extinction moisture levels, but that changed through time, etc. LiDAR can provide a 3D modeling. In terms of fire effects, a lot of again, a single fire event, and we talked about earlier, cumulative, long-term, and fire feedback. So we can incorporate those into our model, because again, one of the keys with prescribed fires, we're trying to achieve specific effects. Whereas wildland fire, just like it's burning, we're just sort of comparing burn versus not burn. So there's a lot of opportunity here. I think we'll see, as we already have, certainly prescribed fire weather, some more science that will support our interest in our practice. I thought this is a quote from the paper. Tools that advance mechanistic connections, that's kind of this fire physics world, coupled fire atmosphere dynamics to ecological fire effects are years away. In the meantime, models can be used to develop innovative training environments such as virtual reality simulations. That sounds interesting, and maybe this already exists, but just as flight simulators are required for pilots, use of such tools for prescribed burn boss training could be, we could see that in the future. So that sounds pretty interesting, right? I remember when I was learning to be a burn boss in Oklahoma, and it's actually a class, and I was like, yeah, I think we could light the fire down here. And just on a research site, I was a training burn boss, and they looked at each other and sort of laughed. And anyways, we burned uphill, and we were chasing fire. Maybe I wouldn't have made that mistake if I'd had a burn simulator here. And here, Emily, I put this in for you. Here's a quote: "The lack of cross applicability from here, Emily, and a recognition that tools developed for wildland fire management do not support the needs of prescribed fire practitioners." That kind of channels our discussions when we're looking at what kind of training do we need in New Mexico for prescribed fire, recognizing, as Laura said earlier, NWCG may not be perfect for, certainly not for private prescribed fire practitioners. So Emily, there you go. Okay, that's about it. Here's just a few other fires. Quick Fire is Rod's paper and software, if you will, that is more focused on prescribed fire and a little more user-friendly than maybe the heavy I forget the name of his other software. Here's Molly Hunters from the Southwest, and this is sort of a random scattering, but of papers. But again, I try to focus on the Southwest. Effects of prescribed fire on wildfire regimes and impacts. Mike Caggiano was an author here, so identifying opportunities for use of broadcast prescribed fire on Colorado's Front Range. So not to be intimidated, again, look at Google Scholar. You can refine it by year, which again, these are all 2020 papers, so it's a pretty useful tool. And then maybe y'all can help me out. I found this picture of this bear with his mask on. I was like, I have no idea what message he's telling me, but it's probably not based in science. So anyways, just kidding, bear. I know some folks are sensitive about that. All right, thank you. I will unshare here, and I don't know if there's any questions.
So Maceo has a comment about fire science as we define it via academic scholarship is relatively recent. However, fire as a stewardship tool producing beneficial results for human and land is an ancient tool and practice, and a scholarship based on generations of observations. And his comment is that here we are finally coming back to that. So do you have any thoughts on, and I know that you had a whole page on some of the cultural ties with the academic scholarship, but
in science, I kind of hate to use the word holistic, but it's kind of like we look to the Southeast sometimes, right? And we see this culture of burning. And so literally, like pun intended, maybe, right? In the West, we want to build up this culture of burning, and there's this cultural burning that was just discussed and commented on. So, right, from policy to culture to people to agencies, the more, I think about Florida, right? They're using interstates to do backfires off of, right? Everybody just keeps driving by at 80 miles an hour. Oh, they're burning again. We're not quite there yet. We obviously have some topography to deal with, but that's kind of, yeah, where we're going. And yes, our Native American brethren kind of give us that picture of using fire early on. So from a science standpoint, we're just kind of scratching the surface, but from a cultural standpoint, fire has been important from the West from early on.
So I'm asking this question to you kind of as our webmaster, as well as having just presented so much information that it was so fast I couldn't grok it all. Will we be putting these PowerPoint presentations on the website, or how could people access, for example, a PDF of your presentation?
Yeah, if the authors are willing, I'm certainly am. We've done it in the past. If you check out our website from some old our fire workshops, when we went around the state doing how do you burn, we put those we put them as PDFs on our website. So sure, we can. I think that can be arranged, and looks like we're recording it, so that's another avenue. Yes.
All right, thanks. Okay, back to you, Emily.
Great, thanks so much. And thanks, Doug, for a great presentation. Okay, so I'm going to share my screen here again really quick. Just so that folks can see our agenda. So we are at the end of the morning session now, and our afternoon session will begin at 1 p.m. Mountain Time with a drone demonstration by Simon Wiebel with Drone Amplified Incorporated. This is a virtual field trip type presentation. I think it's going to be fantastic. We're definitely looking forward to that. So please do plan to come back and join us after the break at 1 p.m. Mountain. It is a different Zoom link, very important. So you can't just leave this Zoom session running. It is a completely different Zoom session. So check your registration. You should have received a separate link for the afternoon session in that email. All right, and with that, I think we will wrap up this morning's session, and we'll see you all back here at 1 p.m. Mountain Time.
Thank you.